Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It is raining here, and so hopefully it's raining with you too, so that you're happy sitting in front of a computer for the evening. So tonight we're going to look at vegetable growing and vegetable growing using organic principles. What we're not going to do is talk about organic, so the certification schemes and selling under an organic certified body. But we are going to talk about that in our next webinar. So if that's something that's of interest, then please sign up for the next webinar, which is in early October. And what we'll talk about there are the marketing side of things and the certification side of things. So if that's of interest, please join us then. So tonight we are joined by Audrey Litterick. So Audrey is a soils expert. She has consultancy firms. She looks at management of soil and digestates and composts. She also is a fiddle player. I feel that's important to let you know. She teaches on the basis and facts qualification courses. So these are recognised by industry for anybody who wants to give fertiliser or pesticide advice. She is co-author of the Scottish Crofting Federation's handbook on horticulture, which is available from the SAF, and it's only £20, I think, so it's a bargain. She also isn't very good at growing carrots this year. So
my carrots have been a disaster.
We'll see evidence of that shortly. So I will share my screen and we have a presentation for you. If you would like to ask questions at any point, then either just interrupt us, put your mic on and interrupt us, or put a question in the chat and then I can read it out. So over to you, Audrey.
Okay. Can I just start by saying I also grow horticultural crops. I've worked on market gardens since I was really quite small. I now realise that I was probably working illegally when I was about 12 or 13, 14, because I was far too young to be doing the hours I was doing, but I really enjoyed it and my parents were glad to get me out of the way, I think. So I've been growing things for a long time. I have to admit that these are not my carrots. You'll see a picture of my this year's carrots shortly. This was an MSc student of mine that was working for a big commercial grower up in on the Murray coast, where there's some fantastic carrot soils. So they were organically grown, fully organic, but certified organic, and not a single hole or disease in them. They were great. So today we're going to be covering, and as Siobhan said, just ask questions at any time. I'd rather keep it interactive, and it's difficult to know what level to pitch it at without asking every single person exactly what their experience is. So if any of you want to delve into a bit more detail on any subject, just put something into the chat, and if I don't notice it, Siobhan will stop me, and we can tackle the questions. So we're going to be covering soils, fertility building and lime and fertilizers, a bit about crop choice and crop rotations, and then a bit about preventing and controlling weeds, pests and diseases the organic way, and a little bit at the end about polytunnel challenges. So we're going to start at the beginning with soils. Obviously, soil science and soil management underpins absolutely everything that we do. It's always a source of sadness and sometimes anger to me that as a soil scientist, soils are very poorly understood by the majority of people. And I don't mean you lot at all, because you'll understand the importance of soil, but and I think governments now understand and are prepared to at least push soils up the agenda a bit, but there's not enough soil scientists out there and enough people who really understand soils in a practical context. You can't even study that as a major subject at uni anymore, and soil scientists are really badly paid. Anyway, as growers, you really do need to understand your soil. And here's an example, unfortunately, of a rather poor soil which has been suffered from a lot of cultivation over a long time, and the soil aggregates there are really quite firm. So by looking at soils, where we need to be considering physical properties, in other words, what they feel like, chemical properties, in other words, how much nutrients are in there, and also the biology, of course. And the biology is only going to come if you've got the physics and the chemistry right. So a physically healthy soil is going to be quite soft enough to allow roots and water and air to penetrate and also to flow around through the soil. So it's really important for you to have a dig around in your soil, use a spade, get down there and have a think. How easy is it for the roots to be able to move around in that soil, and how much life is there in there? You shouldn't be dealing with hard lumps, and you should see clear evidence of pores in there, and also channels, vertical channels, not platy structure where compaction has caused the soil to form into hard layers. And you get those hard layers forming if you've done lots and lots of cultivations and perhaps not added enough organic matter back. You also get hard plates like that if you've had a lot of livestock on the ground, particularly in wet weather, or people wandering around it. In fact, even poultry can cause some of the worst surface compaction possible if the hens are the birds are padding around in wet weather. And all these things need to be addressed. So looking at soil improvement, first of all, before there's a lot of people, you'll hear them talking just now about more and more, which is a good thing, talking about minimizing cultivations. And permaculture is one of the sort of furthest advanced versions of that. That's a step too far for a lot of commercial producers, but basically regenerative farming, you'll hear that topic, that title quite a lot too now. Regenerative farming aims towards minimizing cultivation. But before you start doing that, you've got to eliminate any compacted areas. And if there are hard layers, which might be on the surface or they might be lower down, try to break that up in order to allow water and air to penetrate down. But once you've done that, then it is a good idea to be looking at minimizing cultivations, because the more you cultivate, the more you smash up any fungal networks that are in there, and that can also expose organic matter to the air, which makes it more likely to break down, and you want to conserve it in there. So you need to be prepared to add more organic matter over the years to build up soil health. Soil health, which is really the ability of the soil to sustain long-term good yields of quality crops. Soil health depends on regular returns of organic matter and good organic matter levels in your soil. So if your soil looks a bit pale, then it might well lack organic matter. So it's worth testing for soil organic matter levels and be prepared to add more over the years. Not necessarily massive amounts. In fact, massive amounts at any one go is not really a good thing, because you might be adding too much in the way of nutrients. But you do need to add regular, steady, small amounts of organic matter year on year. You should aim to have at least 30 centimetres depth of friable soil, and in an ideal world, about 50 centimetre depth or more. Many people don't have that 50 centimetres. I do here because I've got an alluvial soil right on the banks of the River Line, and it's probably about 2.5 metres deep of soil, which you might think's a joy, but it's a silt soil, which brings all sorts of its own problems. No soil is absolutely perfect. Everybody's got the problems of some sort, some more than others, though. Okay.
Audrey, can I ask, somebody's asking for recommendations for the best way to break up compacted soils.
Well, that depends where the compaction is. So if you've got surface compaction, sometimes there's absolutely no alternative to either, depending on your scale, no alternative but to use either dig it by hand and break it up into a fine tilth, or use the dreaded rotavator, which is really the enemy of soil structure. And a lot of small scale growers will use rotavators now and again, especially if you get to a bit of a bigger scale. Then it is unfortunately it's a good way to break up compaction, but you're also breaking up some of the good aggregates as well. So it's not something that you should do lightly, rotavating. It's something that you could do if you have to, and try and minimize the amount of time that you're using a rotavator or a power harrow, because they will break up compaction, but they'll also smash up some of the fungal networks, and you'll get a fine tilth, which is only good if you can maintain that. So once you've done it, add lots of organic matter and then try to minimize cultivations if you can. But if you've got compaction lower down, in a very small scale, you would be looking at double digging. So, and again, double digging's not something that you should routinely do. Although some of the old style gardeners said, oh, that's the wonderful thing to do. It's not necessary unless you've got compaction. But if you do have compaction at, say, spade depth or plough depth, if you're going on a bigger scale, then you do have to try to break that up. And so you would be trying to break it up with a pickaxe. So take the topsoil off and put it behind you, and then use a pickaxe or a spade to try and break that up. You don't need to create a tilth with it. You just need to create channels so that water and air can move down. And if you're on a bigger scale, then you would use what's called a subsoil tine and drag that through the soil. But the weather conditions have got to be, or rather the soil conditions have got to be right for that. There's absolutely no point in double digging or in subsoiling if the soil is wet or even its field capacity. What you're aiming to do is take the topsoil out of the way and then shatter the subsoil, or shatter the lower depths, shatter the compaction. And if you think about it, that's only going to really work if your soil's quite dry low down. Frankly, this summer, there's no condition. We've never had the soil in condition that I could be doing that this year. It's remained wet all year, and a lot of parts of Scotland have been the same. In a dry, if you get a dry 6 weeks, that's the time that you should be looking at to shattering your subsoil or breaking up plough pan, for example, or compaction lower down. Double digging, somebody says, that's when you actually remove the top 20 to 30 centimeters. You dig a trench, you put it behind you in a long heap, and then you basically shatter the subsoil or the lower depth, fork it over, or even use a pickaxe. I've had to do that in some soils. And then you dig another trench, you fill that first trench up with the topsoil, thus exposing the lower soil there, and you do the same again. So it's really hard work. Much easier if you're on a bigger scale to use a subsoil tine, and that's where you drag the tine through the soil at the required depth to break up the compaction behind a tractor or a quad bike. So that's that.
Okay.
But it's hard work, and you do not need to do that unless you've already. How you find out where the compaction is, you dig down and see what's down there. It's a slightly specialist job. I do that quite regularly for farmers to help them understand what their soil profile is. So how deep the topsoil is, whether they've got good organic matter levels, what their earthworm numbers are like, and where there is any compaction, if there is any. It's a very useful thing to be able to do. And once you get the hang of doing that, then you can do it yourself every 2 or 3 years.
What about using pigs or using crops? So like turnips.
Pigs are a disaster for soil structure, unfortunately. They won't break up severe compaction, but they're highly likely to cause it. I'm not saying pigs are all bad. Pigs have got lots of good things about them. They're great at They're really good for controlling problem weeds. Not all problem weeds, but many problem weeds. Their best thing is weed control and adding a bit of organic matter back. But as far as soil structure is concerned, they usually make the problem worse rather than better. No animal will sort compaction, unfortunately. They'll usually cause it.
Okay.
Okay, shall we move on then? I'm going to look a bit more at the chemical side of soil chemistry. That's to do with fertility. So soil fertility is the ability of soils to sustain productive yields of healthy crops, but mostly what we're talking about in fertility is the amount of nutrients that are there and also the balance between certain nutrients. And soils differ greatly in that respect. So the only way, you can't guess this, you can tell some things. So if I go into a holding and have a look at the weeds, in other words, the things that are growing on that soil naturally, I can tell a lot about soil fertility and to an extent acidity as well. So very acid soils quite often have maybe they've got maybe some rushes and creeping buttercup, for example. That's to do with moisture as well. And the very fertile soils with lots of nitrogen, they might have quite a lot of chickweed, for example. Chickweed's got a lot of good things about it. Low nitrogen soils might have some legume weeds in there, which is not a bad thing. So you can tell a certain amount by looking at it, but really what you have to do is test your soil. And if you're making money out of your holding and you're growing crops, you want to optimize the yields, maximize the yields perhaps even, you really should be looking at testing every 2 years, but certainly at least every 5 years. And the results that you get will help you understand how much lime to put on, if any, and also how much nutrients to put on. Not just out of a bag, I mean composts and dungs as well. Okay. So what you should do in order to test your soil is sample it. And don't just go into one bit of the field and take a spadeful. What you need to do is get a representative sample, which means think about where you're growing your crops. Is it going to be one field, or is it going to be 2 fields, or maybe a particular area for a polytunnel, for example? If you've got an area you want to put a polytunnel, you should sample that tiny little area separately. And if you've got a growing area, then you should be sampling that on its own. And walk across each particular area in a W pattern and take maybe 10 to 15 small trowelfuls of soil down to 15 to 20 centimeters. So you should end up with about 10 to 15 trowelfuls of soil in a bucket. You are much better to use a soil auger if you've got one, and they can be bought quite cheaply. And the reason I say that's better is because that takes a uniform soil core. So it's like a cylinder of soil right down to 15 to 20 centimeters. And that's much better because a trowelful tends to take a sort of cone of soil with more soil from the top than from the bottom of that depth. And that's not actually a good idea. That can overestimate your nutrient content because the nutrients tend to sort of accumulate at the top of the soil, especially in dry weather. So you're better with an auger if you can. But once you've got your samples, put them in a bucket, mix them together thoroughly, and then send off about 300 grams to a soils lab. For example, SAC Consulting has a lab. Now they're now in partnership with Eurofins. There's other labs as well, but depends. They may ask for a little bit more than 300 grams now because I see that they're doing a little bit more in terms of routine testing. I don't know what the cost is now anymore either because they're testing for more than they used to do. So what to test for?
£25.
£25, is it?
£25, yes. Yeah.
Plus VAT or including VAT?
Oh, plus VAT. Yes, plus VAT. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. Because not everybody's VAT registered, so that might add a bit. That'll add. So it's probably about 32 or something like that then. So what to test for? Well, the routine test is different now to what it used to be. You'll see that in a minute, but I would normally say definitely pH. It's useful to know organic matter as well, and plant available PK and magnesium. So that's phosphorus or phosphate, potash and magnesium. We don't test for nitrogen. That's estimated in a different way. And if anybody's interested in that, then and how much nitrogen to add, then you can ask me later. And possibly also trace elements, particularly if the site's been in long-term cropping. So pH, normally we're aiming for about 6.5. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. pH is really, really important. So pH is a logarithmic scale, which means that a soil of pH 5, say, is 10 times more acid than a soil of pH 6. So you're looking for something about, well, between about 6 and 7, although 6.5 to 7 is probably ideal, better for horticultural crops. Soil pH is really, really important, because it's the pH that affects the availability, the crop availability of particularly phosphate and all of the trace elements. And if soil pH is not right, then your soils are not going to be feeding your plants properly. And I've seen some absolute crackers on crofts where people have been not adding any lime at all for years, and their pH is away down about 5. Now oats might grow not too bad, down about 5, and maybe potatoes, but pretty much very little else will be growing properly. But I've also seen situations on crofts where crofters have been adding a lot of shell sand over the years. That's a liming agent, and they've been overdoing it, and the pH has been away up at 8, and that's a really serious situation as well. So pH is really important to test for it, and really important to try to get that right. Okay, Siobhan, next slide. Actually, two slides. The next one after that. So liming materials, really important to add the correct amount. Now, SAC certainly gives you an idea how much lime you should be requiring, but of course, every liming material is different. So it tells you how much calcium carbonate you should be adding. So ground limestone, I should say. But the strength of each liming material is different. So it's important to adapt the application rate depending on what you've actually got, whether it's shell sand or different types of prilled lime, for example. And different types of lime take different times to react as well. So some's very quick acting and some's a lot slower acting. So you really should be planning ahead. And if your soil's really acid, you'll probably have to split the application over a couple of different years. Best to put it on in the autumn. So I think the best time to test your soils is the autumn, because then you've got time to do something about it. You can apply phosphate fertilizers. Some of them are best applied in the autumn, some best in the spring. Depends on your soil type, really. But lime is generally best applied in the autumn. And in fact, if you are applying phosphate fertilizer, do not apply it at the same time as lime, because the lime can lock up that phosphate. And don't put the lime on immediately before a crop that's liable to suffer from that. So best not put it on before potatoes, because it can make them scabby or scabbier. Right, here's a bit more about soil fertility. Aim to create soils which are sufficiently fertile to grow the crops that you want. So we're particularly talking here about PK and magnesium, so phosphate, potash, and magnesium. So you should be aiming for a particular soil status. Now, in the Scottish system, we say that we've got scales, if you like, for the available levels of crop available PK and magnesium. And those scales go very low, low, moderate, high, and excessively high, or very high in Scotland. And you should be aiming for a P status, so phosphate status of moderate plus. I suppose high is also okay. nowadays, the Scottish Government are pretty agitated about people having soils which are too high in phosphate, because that can lead to pollution. And in fact, some of the most polluted burns I've ever seen have been near small-scale horticultural holdings, well, horticultural holdings where they've been putting on a lot of phosphate fertilizer. So it's now frowned upon to have your soil status too high in phosphate. Best to go for moderate plus. Same for K or potash, moderate plus. So when you get your soil analysis results back, it'll explain what your soil's like in terms of P and K status. And magnesium, you're aiming for moderate. Again, your soil test results will tell you that. As far as nitrogen's concerned, as I said, we don't test for soil nitrogen. You can sort of test for total nitrogen, but it doesn't tell you anything useful, because that might be quite locked up effectively. So how we determine whether whether we need to add more nitrogen is to use SAC technical notes to give you an idea of how much nitrogen crops require, and then you would make an estimate of how much nitrogen is going to be available in the soil based on how much you've put on in the past, how much organic matter you've put on in the form of composts. Now, it's not so easy to add nitrogen if you're an organic grower, because you've no access to bagged synthetic nitrogen like a farmer would. So he could put on sulfate of ammonium or urea or ammonium nitrate. We can't do that as organic growers. So you've got to be thinking along different lines. And in a polytunnel, that might often mean liquid feeds of nitrogen. And you might also put things on like blood meal, for example, or blood and bone. And other than that, you're relying on fertility building crops like clover, vetches, or composts and dungs, for example. Okay, next slide. So you should plan ahead every year to ensure that there's going to be enough nutrients in the soil to allow crops to thrive in the year you're planting them. But as an organic grower, you've got to think further ahead. Because you can't do this reactive thing of just thinking, right, my crops need this amount of nitrogen, there I'll put that on out of a bag at the beginning of the year. You can't really do that. So you've got to try and be adding quite a lot of compost and dung in order to try and make your soils have lots of organic manure in them and or bulky organic matter in them. And then crucially, of course, you're relying on the bugs in that soil to break down those bulky organic fertilizers like compost and dungs, so that they'll become available for crops. So in an organic farming context, it's much, much more important to make sure that you've got enough biology in your soil to be gobbling up all those bulky organic composts and manures and making the nutrients in them available for the crops. So what you should be doing is using soil test results to assess the need for lime and the need for nutrients, and then you apply that lime, you apply bulky organic materials like dung or compost, and then if you have to, you can put some permitted. There are some bagged fertilizers that are permitted. Things like blood and bone meal on its own, rock phosphate. You can also put on sulfate of potash if there is a need, but you shouldn't have to if you've got enough, say, poultry manure, composts, and cattle manures, for example. A lot of people find it a bit much and need to get a bit of help to interpret results in the first instance, and there's no shame in that. Once you get the hang of it, it's really quite easy. And there are some very simple rules. Okay.
Audrey, is there, when you're saying dung, are there particular dungs or farmyard manures that are better than others? So would you say chicken or cattle or pig?
Not really. The crucial point is to know what you've got. So again, you don't have to test your own, But if you're using a material every single year, like your own poultry manure or your own strawy cattle manure that you've got access to, or your own horse dung, or your own compost, I would say it's important to get it tested. So you would test it for, it's not, you don't test it in the same way as soils, you would test it for total N, P and K. That's really it. Total nitrogen and phosphate and potash, and maybe magnesium and sulfur, because it probably won't cost you any more. And if you don't test your own, you can use average values, but you should understand that poultry manure is brilliant, but it is the rocket fuel of the organic world. So it's got masses of nutrients in it. So you should apply that really quite sparingly. Otherwise, you'll end up over applying nutrients. It's great stuff, but it's very nutrient rich. So you would be applying quite small quantities. And be aware that it's not a good organic matter builder. It's not great for building soil health because you really have to apply it at quite low rates, quite small rates. Whereas composts and dungs, like strawy cattle manure and horse dung, they are both soil conditioners and fertilizers. So they contain a lot of organic matter at the rates you're applying them at. You apply them at much higher rates. So to give you an example, well, I will talk about rates in a minute, actually, so I'll not bother to do that just now. There's none that's better than any others. You just need to understand the stuff that you've got. So typical application rates for strawy cattle manure, sheep manure, strawy goat manure, garden composts, horse dungs, that kind of thing, would be about 30 to 60 tonnes per hectare. Now that's the same as about 3 to 6 kilograms per square metre if you're on a smaller scale. But if you've got a really low nutrient soil and you've got evidence for that, you could go on at about 100 tonnes per hectare, which is about maybe 10 kilograms per square metre. It's really quite important to know what that looks like on the ground. So have a play with that. It's absolutely essential to understand what that looks like on the ground, because I know a lot of growers who are applying far, far too much. And you can get into serious trouble if you do that. My soil is far too rich in phosphate. It wasn't me that did it, because my garden was built on the site of a piggery, an old piggery, and I've got extremely high phosphate soils, and that can create a nutrient imbalance. So if your soils are very high in phosphate, then the plants find it difficult to take up enough zinc and enough iron. And this is what can happen. If you've got soils that are far too rich in potash, for example, then it's difficult for your crops to take up enough magnesium. And the reverse is true. If your soils are too rich in magnesium, they can not take up enough potash. So you really are well advised to try to get your soils about right and don't create nutrient imbalances. And to do that, you have to be testing them, doing what I said, trying to aim for those nutrient indices that I've said, and then try and get your application rates about right. So 3 to 6 kilograms per square metre is about right once your soil's kind of at the right indices. But you still wouldn't be applying that before peas and beans, because they don't need any nitrogen, and they'll go backwards if they get too much nitrogen because they fix their own. And not before carrots and parsnips or most root crops, because they don't like too much nitrogen. Otherwise you'll get all tops and no bottoms, if you see what I mean. So so be applying every year in a rotation, but not before legumes and not before pointy root crops, things like carrots and parsnips, for example.
And when you say not before, when's the best time to apply? Is it in winter or
No, I
spring?
mean not before, not the year before application. So if you've got a crop rotation, and I'll go on to talk about that in a minute, then everybody, absolutely everybody, without any exception, should have a crop rotation, whether it's in a polytunnel or outdoors. And say you had a 4-year crop rotation, you would apply nutrients in the form of bulky organic materials every year in that rotation, apart from the year that you're going to be growing, say, carrots, peas and beans. So My carrots are in the same bed or the same year or the same block in the rotation as the peas and beans are. So I don't apply any bulky fertilizers before those things. And the other thing is, if you do apply chunky manures like dungs, it makes carrots a sort of fork or fang. Not that my carrots are things of beauty, as you'll see this year anyway, unfortunately, but you should be applying, keeping away from putting chunky things in the soil then too.
And would you put on manure over winter?
Depends what kind it is. Poultry manure, I would tend to put that on in the spring because you can lose a lot of nitrogen from it if you put it on too early. Because the nitrogen is quite reactive. But I would tend to put it on. Oh, quite often I do put it on in the autumn, but spring's okay as well. The only thing I would say is that I would never put any dung on in spring if you're going to be growing crops that could potentially be eaten raw. Never do that. It's not a good idea. It's really quite risky. I would say particularly risky in a polytunnel because you'll always get E. coli and salmonella. In fact, I've got it in red there, yeah. You'll always get E. coli and potentially even other nasty things like listeria and salmonella in dungs. And you don't want that on anything that you might be eating raw. Okay. So crop choice, we've got pink fir apple tatties there, cauliflowers and courgettes. So vegetables and salads, I would say, good option. Start with things that you know you can grow. If you've not been growing before, you're quite new to it, or you want to start growing on a commercial scale, grow what you know you can grow and also grow what you know you can sell, importantly. And don't forget about the non-vegetable things as well, which can work quite well on holdings. So top fruit like apples and plums and pears and even cherries if you're far enough south. Cherries are probably a bit ambitious outside of Polytunnel and as far north as Shetland. And also things like herbs, and consider also some of the essential oil crops, which can be a good source of income as well. So that's yeah, some of the mints, for example, and also ornamentals. It doesn't have to be vegetables, and native trees and shrubs even. But as I said, if you're new to growing, then it's worth looking for the easier things or the faster growing things that you can get 2 or 3 crops in a season, and try to grow those that you will be able to use or sell. It's a sad fact that even if you're a brilliant grower, which many of you probably will be already, you're not going to make any money unless you're also good at selling that stuff. And it's the downfall of lots of really excellent growers who've got really green fingers, that they're not good at the social media side and the marketing side. So that's why there's another webinar set up in addition to this one to talk about that side of things. But do read up on the crops that you've decided to grow and learn as much about them as you possibly can. Variety choice is absolutely top of the importance list as well. Choose things with a good flavour, because that's what gives you an absolute unique selling point. And that's why we still grow things on a small scale. This is our garden here, and these beds are only 18 square meters. So that's 3 meters by 6. There's only 4 of them, and there's an additional orchard with 6 trees. There's a fruit cage which is about 4 meters by 8 meters, and in that small area we are pretty much self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables, and sell our surplus in a farm shop and make more than enough money to buy all the seeds that we need every year, and all the sundries and things that we need every year, with a bit left over. So you really don't need a massive area, but Why we do it is not about earning money, it's about homegrown produce or small scale grown produce can taste so much better than what you get in the shops, particularly I would say potatoes, tomatoes, cucumbers, salads, and brassicas. You don't notice the difference, or I don't notice the difference so much with things like the allium crops. To me, an onion is an onion and a leek is a leek, but a lot of the other crops and the fruit as well, so much better than what you get in the shops. But look for heritage varieties, varieties that you know have a good flavour. And unfortunately, particularly with potatoes, not just potatoes though, some of the varieties which are most blight resistant and therefore which find their way into the supermarkets as organic potato varieties are disgusting. They really are. They don't taste good. They might look good and they might be relatively unsusceptible disease, but they're horrible. And I'm talking about things like Lady Balfour, which I would challenge anybody to actually enjoy. Right, crop rotation, an absolutely golden rule of organic production systems or small scale horticultural systems. You absolutely must rotate your crops. It's the main way that you'll be able to prevent pests, diseases. It's the main way that you'll be able to control weeds or help you to control weeds on a small scale. It also helps you to make the best use of nutrients and helps you to protect and enhance soil structure. So it's really, crop rotation is vitally important. So you should divide your land into at least 4 areas. 6 areas is better because then you can have an area that is completely rested 1 year in 6, or even 2 years in 6. And complete rest is better. And this is important whatever scale you're at. This is my greenhouse, which really isn't very big. I think it's 12 feet by 6 feet, and it's got 4 beds in it, and they're divided down to a depth of 20 centimeters. And I try to keep the soil separate in each of the areas and not mix the soil up between beds. And it greatly reduces the chance of serious soil-borne pests and diseases. Doesn't eliminate that, because you do get some soil-borne diseases, particularly sclerotinia, which affects all crops, but it helps a great deal. So we've got 8 main plant families. So to do crop rotation, you have to understand which plants are in which families, obviously. So we've got 8 plant families that are the main ones, excluding some of the wacky ones like some of the essential oil crops and ornamentals and so on. So we've got brassicas, and that's a massive family, including a lot of what you want to grow. So kales, cabbages, cauliflowers, broccoli, sprouts, rocket, lots of the different salad species, kohlrabi and radish. These are the main examples. And then there's the oniony family, things like onions, leeks, spring onions, garlic. And then there's the cucumbers, courgettes, pumpkins, marrows, and squashes. Legumes, well, there's the ones you eat, like peas and beans, but then there's the ones that you don't eat. And in proper organic production systems, certified organic, you have to have fertility building phases in there, true fertility building phases, which basically means clover and vetches and things like that. And you can't eat them. So they represent a sort of money lost, if you see what I mean. Although you might grow things like runner beans, broad beans, French beans, they're not really fertility building. People think that they are, but they're not really, because most of the nitrogen that's fixed by these miraculous legume plants goes into the bit that you harvest and eat, and not very much ends up actually building the fertility in your soil. So, but the organic certification bodies tend to sort of kind of permit people to manage without fertility building phases in greenhouses and tunnels most of the time, because it's just too expensive. The cost of owning a polytunnel or buying a polytunnel is so high that you need to make as much money from that as possible. And then there's the beetroot family, the lettuce family, the potato family as well. unfortunately, a lot of what you want to grow in a polytunnel falls into either the cucumber family or the potato family, because tomatoes, aubergines, and peppers are all in the same family. And then there's the carrot parsnip family, which I don't tend to grow in a polytunnel, for various reasons. Not least, carrots can be very good at attracting and building up sclerotinia or cottony soft rot, which is a nasty disease of just about everything else. Okay. So the rules are, for crop rotation, try to combine crops with similar needs. So really by that I mean nutrient needs in the same block. So if something needs a lot of fertility, I would put it together. So I put all my brassicas in one bed because they need a lot of feeding if you want to get good yields. I put my tatties all in the one bed because we eat a lot of potatoes, and unfortunately potatoes are one of these crops that you really can't get away. If you want decent yields, you can't really get away without digging your soil quite deeply, and I do. Not everybody does. Some people have managed permaculture potatoes, but I've never managed to be very good at that. So because it's the only crop that I really dig the soil deeply with, sometimes with carrots too. So put tatties on their own. And then I've got peas and beans in with carrots, and sweet corn and coriander, and which is the same family as carrots. And then I've got everything else in another bed. So things like courgettes and all the alliums and one or two other things. So, but there's no golden rule. You can do things differently depending on how much of each different type of crop you like to eat. The other rules are never put lime on before potatoes because it can make them scabby. It is a good idea, however, to keep potatoes as far away from lime in your rotation as you can. So put lime on 1 year in 4 if you need to, but put it before brassicas because they love it. And also, if you're unlucky enough to have clubroot, which is a horrible disease of brassicas, which unfortunately I do through no fault of my own, I do put lime on before the brassicas because that helps prevent the clubroot damage. Always grow nutrient demanding crops like tatties or brassicas immediately after a big dump of dung or compost, and grow weed suppressing crops like potatoes. Potatoes are great for suppressing weeds. If you've had a really weedy plot, I always put potatoes on first in the rotation because they kind of shade out the weeds. Also try to grow 2 or 3 crops per year if you can. So for example, with salads, and also try never to leave the soil bare. That's particularly important with a very fertile soil or a silty soil like mine, which just goes into a horrible decline if it's bare. A bit about crop protection now. Our attempts to keep crops healthy. I'm proud to say that was not my scabby potato on the bottom left. That's common scab, which is particularly common in soils that have been overlimed or are sandy. It's very, very common in the macher soils of the Western Isles. That is on tomatoes, the top left, that's Verticillium dahliae, which unfortunately I have got in my garden through no fault of my own. That on the top right there is boron deficiency in cauliflower, which is not mine either. And I'm sad to say these are my carrots from this year, and which have been really badly affected by carrot fly because the barrier that I used failed. So crop protection is our attempts to keep our crops healthy and free from nutrient deficiencies as well. Okay, next slide. So quickly about weeds. Weeds seem to be hated in sort of old style conventional cropping, but even in regenerative farming now, so-called conventional regenerative farming, we're starting to embrace weeds a bit more. And as small-scale organic growers, we should certainly be embracing weeds to an extent. What you're trying to do is make your holding, not just the growing areas, but the areas all round about, as diverse as you possibly can in terms of plant species, because that will help give you a diverse ecosystem in terms of all the animals that live there too, in terms of microorganisms, insects, hopefully the beneficial ones as well as the not so great ones, and also the bird species, which are just nice to watch, and other animals too. But there's got to be a limit. So what you're trying to do is let the weeds be. Try not to let them increase. So try to avoid them seeding all over the place, and try not to let them reduce your crop yields, basically. Other than that, to some extent, I try to embrace them. So complete elimination of weeds from small-scale cropping systems is not a good idea. And I tend to allow them to be there to an extent, rather than leave the soil bare between establishing crops. But perennial weeds are never really a good idea in a growing system. And by that, I mean things like, couch grass with deep roots, and creeping buttercup, for example, perennial nettle. They're a no-no, but annuals until they start to seed, or perennial weeds in their first year can be a good thing rather than a bad thing. Let's look a bit at pests and diseases. Well, what we've got to look at is prevention rather than cure, because you have very little in your arsenal, really, as organic growers, to actually do any cures. You've got no access really to synthetic pesticides, and most people don't want to be using those nowadays anyway. And in fact, even the conventional farmers working towards regenerative farming are kind of having to do that, because we're losing active ingredients in pesticides very, very rapidly. So there's increased interest in all agriculture and horticulture in trying to prevent diseases and pests rather than just have reactive measures. So what we're trying to do in organic systems is use a whole range of different partial control measures, none of which will work on their own, but together should give you acceptable control of the pests and diseases that you've got coming at you. And you're guaranteed to have pests and diseases coming at you all the time. This has been a terrible year for slugs for many people. For me, it was a terrible year for carrot fly. It just, every year's different, and every soil's different, and every holding's different. So it's a case of learning what you're going to be attacked by, and then trying to find ways of getting around it.
Can I ask,
Yes.
specifically green fly on sprouts?
Yeah, funny you should ask that. I've never had green fly on any brassicas before, and this year I had a terrible attack on 3 plants. There's very little that you can do, but interestingly, I went in. I've got a sprayer which is just a little hand sprayer, and I go in there and I've got all my brassicas under a net, so I've got massive bastions against 2 main problems in brassicas, and one of them is cabbage root fly. So I've got collars around all the brassica plants, and I've got a net over the top to prevent a butterfly net to prevent the butterflies getting in. So I have to admit, I was a bit late in realizing how badly my brassicas were being attacked, and it wasn't every plant. For some reason, it was only one variety of purple sprouting broccoli and one variety of sprouts. So I came a bit late to the party, but I went in there with, now it's basically a very dilute solution of fairy liquid. Well, you could probably use EcoVer as well, but I never tried that. All I had in my shed was the fairy liquid. So about 1 part per 1,000, literally. So what is that? It's about 1 ml of fairy liquid in a litre. And then spray it pretty hard so that you're actually blasting the green fly off the plant. You're not really killing them. You might kill a few, but you're blasting them onto the ground. you can't do that on a really big scale
Hmm.
unless you perhaps tried it with a high pressure knapsack sprayer, which would work just as well. But you've got to have that physical blasting. And it didn't harm the sprouts, it didn't harm my plants at all.
So
But crucially, you're not using a pesticide. And what I noticed after about 3 or 4 weeks is the beneficials came in. Now they're parasitic, other parasitic insect species, so parasitic aphid species. And you can see them. Go in and have a look. So I ended up doing this about once every 3 or 4 days. And I still got a bit of aphid damage. So there's still a bit of curly leaf. But they are producing sprouts now and they are producing broccoli. But what you see is the parasitized aphids in there, which means that you really should be congratulating yourself if you get those parasitized aphids. So what the aphids look like is a little brown ball, sort of hard, crispy shell about the same size as an aphid, but it looks like a little blown up aphid, which is what it is. So the parasitizing species go in and lay their eggs inside the aphids' bodies. And then, so it's natural biological control. Now, you can actually buy these, and people who are in greenhouses and polytunnels do buy these if they've got aphid problems, from companies like Coppert. And you can actually apply those biological control agents, and they work to control aphids indoors. But I don't find they work all that well outdoors. So I don't think it's worth the money. I think a better solution is simply to do all the things that ensure you've got a very biodiverse insect population. And by that, I mean have lots of different weed species and native species round about. Don't spray any pesticides. And those natural biological control agents, those natural predators will turn up by themselves. But you've got to allow them a week or so to do that. And it doesn't happen on every holding because not every holding has got good, it's not got good biodiversity. I didn't used to get it, but I am getting it now, those parasitic things.
Yeah. This is in a polycrub that we only started planting in June. I did buy 25 young ladybirds and a wee house for them. But of course, it's too early for them to eat all of the greenfly, and the greenfly are increasing. I've been leaving the doors open so that I've seen a hoverfly come in, so I know they can help, but it's quite a lot of greenfly. I will try the washing up liquid. I just wasn't sure. I didn't want to hurt the ladybirds.
Well, that's the benefit of, I would stick to that 1 part in 1,000. So it's about a mil in a litre. And physically blast it. It won't affect the ladybirds.
No.
And the other thing is, try to be a bit relaxed about the weed populations in there and the biodiversity, so that you've got some other things in there to encourage as much as you can get in there. If it's a new tunnel or a new polycrub, then you probably won't have much in there yet.
No.
But if you've got the door open, and I certainly would recommend keeping the door open and having diversity outside, it will definitely move in.
Okay, good.
I think you've done the right thing with buying ladybirds as well.
Oh, good. I have been spraying it hard with the hose to, spray them off its purple sprouts.
Yeah.
But I'll do the washing up liquid as well, as long as I'm not hurting ladybirds. That's great. Thank you so much.
No, that shouldn't hurt ladybirds. I wouldn't put it, don't be tempted to put any more fairy liquid in that. What the fairy liquid effectively does is it breaks down the waxy coating on the aphids' backs. It works reasonably well on whitefly as well, and so it really does inconvenience the aphids, but it shouldn't harm hoverflies, ladybirds, lacewings, things like that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Problem.
Our meeting chat is quite interesting because some of the questions and answers get mixed up. So the advice for getting rid of greenfly turns out to be snails. But I think the snails were the issue because then they get fed to the chickens, and I don't think it's the aphids that are or the greenfly that are getting fed to the chickens. So there's good conversations going on in the chat.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Right, where we are. Your main pest problems would probably be things like aphids, slugs and snails, vine weevil if you are growing certain types of ornamentals, carrot fly, cabbage root flies, moles, birds, rabbits, deer, and maybe even nematodes, including PCN, potato cyst nematode. And your main diseases, probably everybody that I know gets blight, potato blight. It's very important to understand how to recognise that late blight of potato. If you don't know how to recognise it confidently, then get somebody to help you to do that, so that you can, as soon as you see it, it moves up from the southwest every single year. And we were very late in getting it. I only chopped my tatties down last week. And they were late in, so I was really glad to have them in the ground for as long as they were. But you should be, once your leaves have got some blight on them, I certainly wouldn't let them get any more blighty looking than that in the picture. Chop them right off at or ideally slightly below soil level to prevent that spores being washed down into the soil. And then you've got skin diseases on tatties, which don't normally affect the taste of the potato, but they might affect the saleability. Botrytis, the great enemy of polytunnel growers, affects a lot of crops. Mildews, downy mildew, powdery mildew, rusts, white rotten onions, probably not so much further north, but south it can be. Vascular wilts, that's things that live in the soil and can attack tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and so on. Damping off, that's usually seedlings and young plants. And sclerotinia, root and stem rots. A lot of people don't know this disease, but it can be really quite nasty, particularly in tunnels. So here's your pest and disease control strategies. These strategies help you with everything, really. So crop rotation is your number one, and it won't control everything, and it certainly won't control airborne diseases, but will help control soil-borne pests and diseases. We've already talked about this, enhancing your numbers of naturally occurring predators, parasites, and antagonists, and you can do that by having as much diversity as you can in the growing area and also round about it in terms of other plant species. And be prepared to buy biological control agents too, if you think it'll help. Some do, particularly indoors, and be aware of the temperatures at which you're using them. You'll hear a lot of gardening programs talking about using nematodes for slugs, for example, or for vine weevil. They can work really well, but in Scotland, we shouldn't be applying them ever if the temperatures are too low for the things to actually work, because they're quite expensive. So read the label is what I'm saying. You will have less pest and disease problems if your soil pH is right and you've got plenty of fertility in there. Stressed plants get more diseases and pests. It's exactly the same with humans. If you've not got the right food and the right amounts of food, you will get ill. Use resistant species and varieties if you've got access to them by looking the varieties up before you buy them. Use crop and variety mixtures if you can, so no great big areas of the one variety, especially if it's a disease susceptible variety. You can also escape certain pests and diseases by changing the time of sowing. I used to be able to do that with my carrots, and I can't anymore. And I think climate change is having an impact on the incidence of certain pests and diseases. Well, it definitely is. Some are getting more. But I can, by planting tatties early where I can, and also planting broad beans early where I can, the worst problems of disease are avoided altogether. I put biofumigation there. If you do get a nasty soil pest, for example, potentially even disease, although I'm less sure about that working, you can actually put in a plant, particularly some of the mustards, which can be chopped up after they flower, and then you dig them into the soil and then cover it in polythene. And it's a bit weird for organic farming, really, because actually it's a bit like a pesticide. But it's a very natural pesticide in that it's a plant that you might grow naturally. But biofumigation is a standard practice where you get nematodes, for example, causing serious problems with so things like potato cyst nematode or some of the other nematodes. It can work well controlling that. But it's a general, rather brutal sterilant, and you'll kill as many goodies in your soil as you will baddies, unfortunately. You got to make full use of barriers, things like polythene, fleece, and mesh cages. They usually can work really well. I can't grow brassicas without barriers at all. They would all get covered in caterpillars, but they work 100% brilliantly if they're there. You can use permitted products, things like sulfur, for example. I never do. I never really feel a need to do that. Okay. Outdoors or indoors, should you be using a polytunnel? I would say you're mad if you don't. If you've got the money, definitely make full use of crop protection in the protected cropping, I should say, in the form of a glasshouse, a polytunnel, a polycrop, and also cloches. I couldn't do without my mesh and fleece cloches at the start of the season to get my courgettes in early, for example. Quite often I end up planting courgettes and sometimes French beans as well, when I think the risk is over, and then you get brutally cold gales blasting everything to bits, and without the fleece cloches I couldn't do it. And polytunnels can really help too, obviously, by extending the season and letting you grow things all year round. The problem with polytunnels is that it's difficult to rotate crops because so many of the crops you want to grow to make money are from a very few plant families. And that can result in build-up of soil-borne pests and diseases. So try and make your rotation as big as you can. Really ideally go for still a 4-course crop rotation if you can do so. So I've got a cucumber marrow one block, a tomato aubergine pepper block, a peas and beans one, and a salad, including brassicas one, and it works really quite well. And you'll seriously reduce the pest and disease problems. Most people don't bother with a genuine fertility building phase in a polytunnel. In other words, a clover phase. I would say don't bother. The other thing about polytunnels, particularly polycrubs, because they don't have much ventilation. You can open the front door and the back door, but not the sides, which is very far from ideal. It can get quite hot in there, even in Shetland, and a lack of ventilation or excessive humidity is actually a bigger risk and a bigger challenge than cold temperatures. So you've really got to, especially in the months of probably June, July, August, September, probably mostly August, September, make sure you can increase the ventilation as much as you can, and that reduces the risk of botrytis and sclerotinia, which is far more of a worry than botrytis is, because that can get into the soil and you'll never get it out once it's in. Okay, so take-home messages here then. For organic production, try to use fertility building crops where you can. That's things like clovers and vetches. Obviously, you won't make any money from that side of things, but it is worth doing. It also gives the soil a rest from cultivation. Other than that, you're relying on bulky organic fertilizers like composts. I forgot to mention with poultry manures, they're not a soil conditioner. They're not building up your soil organic matter. They're a fertilizer, and a very, very strong fertilizer. So you really are only looking at putting poultry manure on it. Oh, probably 4 or 5 tons per hectare, which is only about 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 kilograms per square meter. So 400 grams per square meter, no more than that. or it's probably too much. Test your soils to make sure you're getting it right, and rely on a whole range of different measures to try to prevent pests and diseases. So crop rotation is top of that, and choosing the right varieties and the right cultural measures, you should have minimal problems. You'll always have problems. Every year you'll have pest and disease problems, and probably they'll be different every year. You've just got to try not to get too depressed about it, and learn about the crops that you want to grow as much as you can. I'm still learning. It doesn't matter how many. I've been growing things since I was probably about 12, and I'm still on what I consider to be a steep learning curve in terms of growing my own stuff. So it's always going to be a challenge, but hopefully you'll find it a good fun challenge.
That's only 20 years though, Audrey.
I wish, Siobhan. Yes, no, I'm long in the tooth now.
There are a couple of questions that I missed. So there's a bit about using green manures, field beans. Somebody's using field beans as a green manure, and a question around using seaweed as well.
Yes, field beans are a fantastic green manure. Again, if you're going to be taking the field beans off and using them for animal feed, that's not a great fertility building crop. However, if you're chopping the whole thing up and putting it back into the field, it's a phenomenal green manure, because you're putting fresh organic matter back into the soil, and it will be fixing a lot of nitrogen. So that's a really good thing to be doing, without a shadow of a doubt. And what was the other question, Siobhan?
Using seaweed.
Seaweed, in terms of its nutrient content, it's actually very much like fresh cattle dung, fresh strawy cattle manure. So it's got really good amounts of NP and K in it. It's a great fertilizer. It's not so good as an organic matter builder. A lot of water in it as well, but I'm a big fan. It's also got quite a lot of trace elements in it, which is useful to soils. Lots of iodine, which is good for people. That'd be not so good for plants. I would say, I don't have any access to seaweed because I'm probably about as far away from the sea as it's possible to be in Scotland, right in the middle. But if I did live close to the coast, I would definitely use it, and I would probably choose to bring it in and apply it in autumn to cover up any areas of bare soil. Although the regenerative farming people always talk about not leaving soil bare, it's very, very different in Scotland to what it is in England if you're a small-scale grower, because it's quite possible as a small-scale grower of horticrops in England to establish a cover crop over winter after your cash crop. And I just can't do that. I mean, a lot of my crops are all still in the ground. The tatties are cut, but they won't be harvested until the skins are set. So they'll probably not be coming out of the ground till the end of September. That's far too late to put any cover crop in. And most of the other crops are still being harvested and will be right up until the end of September, even later than that. And all the brassica crops, a lot of my cabbages don't get harvested till February. So what do? Well, if you've got seaweed, you can put it actually on the ground round about the crops now, and it'll gradually break down over the winter. And if there's too much salt in it, then that just gets washed down out of the soil profile that you're sowing seeds in, which is good, which is a good thing. If I've got weeds there, I tend to leave them as well. I try not to let them seed, particularly annual meadowgrass, which is a pain, or any perennial weeds. But other than that, I just leave them as a green manure. So it's not off topic really, because seaweed is a great way of protecting your soil from heavy raindrops, which can really cause damage. I really mean that. It really can damage soil structure, especially of silty soils. And if you can't establish a cover crop over winter to protect your soil and conserve the nutrients, then let the weeds do the job. So when I'm controlling weeds in small scale cropping, I make sure I control them at the yield limiting stage, which is during crop establishment, really. And once the crops are maturing, I let them go in, and I'm particularly happy to have and I'll even mow annual meadowgrass if there's a lot of it to stop its seeding, because it's a good thing unless it's seeding, because it'll die off before you do much. It's probably one of your dream cover crops, providing it's not seeding. And similarly with chickweed, it's a great cover crop.
That's good. Yeah, sounds like an excuse to me, but that's good. Somebody else
Exactly.
is using Phacelia. Is Phacelia the same as borage? Or is it the same?
No,
No, different.
no. Phacelia's an absolutely wonderful companion crop. Where we're not a crop exactly, but it's a really wonderful thing for biodiversity. It's phenomenal for encouraging ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies. I love it. It will usually die over the winter, and if it doesn't, then you can plough it back in or hike it out. But it's definitely something to be encouraged. It's not particularly competitive against the crops that you're going to be eating. So it's a good thing to be allowing that. Yeah.
Okay. And so you're just either pulling out weeds or chopping the heads off before they seed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could pull them out and just leave them on the soil surface. Or mow them if there's lots of them. Actually, just run a mulch mower over the top of them, if you can do that. You can use a really lightweight electric mulch mower, which is not doing much damage. Or if you're in a bigger scale, a lightweight petrol mulch mower does a really good job. I'm on too small a scale for that. I just basically use shears.
Okay. And last question. So on the same topic, bare earth areas in the polycrop, what would you suggest as a cover crop until planting time? What would you do?
If you can get it established, one of the short-term clovers, crimson clover is quite a good one. In theory, that should die off. But if you're in a polycrop, I doubt you'd get enough frost for it to die off. But so you'd have to dig it in or hike it out. That's probably a pretty good one. Or you could sow a mixed green manure, but it's getting quite late for that now. Some things, it's not just to do with temperature, it's also to do with light levels. And in Shetland by now, at this time of year, you'll have very, very low light intensity, and probably cover crops won't establish all that well if you sow them late on. So you might be, another idea in a polycrop would be to sow it really quite early. So once your crops are getting established and they're getting ready to go ripe, then sow your cover crops round and about in between your cash crops, so that you're sowing in sort of mid-July or end of July or beginning of August, rather than late August, when you might start to have difficulty with establishment. You don't want to go to the expense of buying cover crop seed. I mean, it really can be quite expensive if it's not going to establish. And outdoors, that's why I don't do it, because it's a waste of money. I've tried it and tried it and tried it, and it doesn't work. And a lot of farmers find the same thing. And it really depends how far north you are. There's a very, very big difference in light intensity between Stranraer and Shetland. And you've still got pretty good light intensity down in Stranraer. I don't anymore. And you won't in Shetland either. Not helped by the fact we've had hardly any sun this year.
True. Okay, so there are a few other questions that have come in, but we'll respond to them afterwards, so that, because it's nearly bedtime. So my last plea to you is that after this, you'll get a link to complete an evaluation form, and it's great if you could fill it in for us and let us know not just what you thought, but it does ask for other comments, and if you can put in there what you'd like to see, and then hopefully we can tailor these webinars for you and make sure that we're hitting the spot. So it'd be really good if you can fill them in, and you also get entered into a prize draw for a hamper. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening and sticking with us. And thank you very much to Audrey. Excellent as usual, and tons of information. And I have to say thank you very much to all the people on the chat, because there's been loads of advice back and forth and offers for help and where do you live and let's meet. Maybe not go into that. So, thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.